When Marie Antoinette first arrived in France in 1770 as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess, she represented not only a royal marriage, but a powerful alliance between two great European dynasties. As she crossed the Rhine and stepped into French territory, the girl who had grown up in the glittering courts of Vienna was greeted with fireworks, music, and lavish celebrations. Few could have imagined that this same young girl would one day be dragged through hostile crowds, imprisoned like a criminal, and executed in a spectacle unprecedented in European history. Her fall would become one of the most dramatic political and personal tragedies of the 18th century. For almost 2 decades, Marie Antoinette lived in a world of unimaginable privilege. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a universe designed around the whims of royalty. Every morning she awoke surrounded by courtiers whose sole purpose was to serve her. Her gowns were sewn from the finest silks in the world. Her jewelry collection rivaled those of entire nations, and her days were filled with banquets, operas, masked balls, and gardens where she strolled beside fountains built solely for the entertainment of the French monarchy. But beneath these glittering surfaces, danger was quietly growing. France was drowning in debt, cities were swelling with the poor, bread prices were rising, and every luxury Antoinette enjoyed, no matter how common for royalty, was turned into proof that she was out of touch, foreign, and uncaring. Pamphlets mocked her, nicknamed her Madame Deficit, and spread rumors about her private life. Many of these accusations were false, but they fueled a dangerous fire, resentment of a queen seen as too extravagant, too foreign, and too powerful. By the late 1780s, the monarchy was cracking under pressure, and the crowds in Paris no longer whispered their hatred. They screamed it. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 was the moment France would never turn back from revolution. While Louis XVI hesitated, hoping to negotiate peace, Marie Antoinette sensed something darker coming. She wrote increasingly desperate letters to her Austrian relatives, begging for support, fearing that revolutionaries wanted not negotiations, but the destruction of the monarchy itself. Still, she continued her royal duties. She appeared on balconies to calm furious crowds, reassuring them that she was a mother to the people of France. Yet each attempt only deepened the revolutionaries' suspicion. The queen, who once dazzled the court with diamonds, now watched mobs gather outside Versailles with sticks and rifles. She heard the chants that echoed through the corridors, "Down with the Austrian woman." The same public that once applauded her elegance now demanded her downfall. The breaking point arrived on the morning of October 5, 1789. Thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles, furious at the scarcity of bread and determined to confront the royal family. What began as a demand for food turned into a violent takeover of the palace. Revolutionaries stormed the queen's bedchamber, killing her guards. Marie Antoinette escaped only moments before they burst through her doors, fleeing barefoot down cold marble hallways. She later wrote that she could still hear the screams of the attackers echoing inside her head. That night, the royal family was forced to leave Versailles forever. Surrounded by armed mobs, Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI, and their children were marched to Paris as prisoners in all but name. Crowds jeered, spat, and shouted obscenities as the royal carriage rolled slowly through the streets. After decades of living in a palace where everything, from the air she breathed to the ground she walked on, was designed to elevate her status, she now entered a city boiling with hatred. At first, the confinement at the Tuileries Palace was softened by the illusion of royalty. They still maintained some attendance, still dressed properly, still observed court rituals. But day by day those luxuries vanished. Guards monitored every movement. Courtiers loyal to the monarchy were dismissed, letters were read and censored, spies filled the hallways, even her children were watched carefully to prevent any attempted escape. Marie Antoinette, once the most admired woman in Europe, was now a symbol of everything the revolution wanted to destroy. In June 1791, she made her most desperate decision. She attempted to flee France with her family. Disguised in plain clothing, they snuck out of the palace under cover of night and travelled toward the border. It was the Queen's last hope, to escape, join loyal forces, and restore order before the revolution consumed the country entirely. But the plan failed spectacularly. Recognized in the town of Varennes, they were arrested and dragged back to Paris. This moment sealed their fate. The revolution no longer saw them as misguided rulers, but as traitors. Her public image collapsed even further. The newspapers portrayed her as a conspirator who plotted with foreign powers against France. Cartoons depicted her as a serpent, a witch, a monster. Crowds demanded her head. And the revolution, eager to appease them, stripped away the monarchy altogether. In August 1792, revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries. Bloodshed filled the palace, and the royal family narrowly escaped massacres. This time, there was no palace left to imprison them in. They were taken to the Temple, an ancient fortress that would become both her prison and her graveyard. Inside the Temple prison, Marie Antoinette faced a world she could never have imagined. Her days of silk, gold, and power were gone. Her cell was cold, damp, and infested with insects. Guards taunted her, watching her every move. She slept on a hard bed, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of mildew. Her meals were simple, often stale. Her gowns were replaced with plain, rough clothing. But worse than the physical discomfort was the loss of her family piece by piece. Her husband was executed in January 1793. Her son was taken from her and subjected to brutal re-education, forced to accuse her of crimes she did not commit. Her daughter was isolated from her. Marie Antoinette was left alone, her world shrinking to 4 stone walls. The fall from Versailles to prison was not just a fall from power. It was a total collapse of identity, dignity, and hope. Everything she had ever been, everything she had ever represented, was stripped away systematically. She went from being the most protected woman in France to the most despised. Every day inside the Temple was a reminder that her life was no longer her own, and yet, despite everything, she refused to break. Those who saw her in prison wrote that she carried herself with a quiet strength, even as her health deteriorated. Her hair turned white from stress, her body weakened. But the same queen once accused of extravagance now survived on almost nothing, enduring each humiliation with a dignity that surprised even her enemies. Her fall was not sudden. It was a slow, merciless descent from unimaginable luxury to unthinkable suffering, and it was only the beginning. The true horrors she faced would unfold in the months leading up to the guillotine, and Marie Antoinette was transferred from the Tuileries to the Temple prison in August 1792. She did not enter simply another holding place. She entered a world care, fully engineered to destroy her dignity, sanity, and identity. Revolutionaries did not merely want to kill the queen, they wanted to break her long before the blade touched her neck. The Temple became the laboratory for that cruelty. Its stone walls, cold corridors, and echoing stairwells would witness a systematic campaign of humiliation that few monarchs in history have ever endured. The Temple prison was a medieval fortress looming like a grim monument to a lost age. Its thick walls seemed permanently damp, and its narrow windows allowed only a sliver of grey Parisian light to seep in. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mould, iron, and old wood. It was cold even in summer, and freezing in winter. To a woman who had lived decades surrounded by gold leaf, velvet curtains, warm fireplaces, and perfumed air, the Temple was not simply a prison. It was a sensory shock designed to disorient her completely. Yet the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torment that awaited her, the removal of identity. The first move the guards made was symbolic and cruel. They stripped Marie Antoinette of every reminder of royalty. No gowns, no attendants, no personal belongings. Her hairstyle, once a symbol of her famed elegance, was left unkempt because she no longer had a hairdresser. Her mirror was removed. Even her titles and name were taken from her. She was no longer Her Majesty, but the Widow Capite, a cold label referencing her dead husband and denying her any royal dignity. To revolutionaries, this was essential. A queen, even imprisoned, still held symbolic power. They believed that breaking her began with making her forget who she had been. The constant surveillance. Inside her cell, Marie Antoinette was never alone. Guards stood just feet away, watching her even as she slept. The queen had no curtains, no privacy, not even during the most intimate moments of life. The guards were instructed to observe her continuously, under the reasoning that she might try to escape or communicate with counter-revolutionaries. But the true purpose was more sinister: humiliation. They recorded her movements, commented loudly about her appearance, mocked her tears, and even made crude jokes at her expense. When she prayed, they made fun of her faith. When she tried to sleep, they paced loudly in the hallway or rattled the metal latches. The queen, who once commanded the attention of Europe, was now forced to endure ridicule from men who enjoyed seeing her collapse piece by piece. The psychological torture through darkness and silence. Marie Antoinette's cell was lit only by a small barred window that let in minimal daylight. In winter months, the cell was pitch black for long hours. Revolutionaries understood the power of sensory deprivation. Darkness disorients, confuses, and weakens the mind. Silence becomes a form of torture when accompanied by fear. Sometimes guards would intentionally isolate her for days, avoiding conversation and refusing to answer questions. They knew silence could be devastating. At other times they created the opposite effect, banging on doors, shouting, or laughing loudly outside her cell at midnight. Sleep deprivation slowly took its toll. Her skin paled, her eyes grew hollow, and her once strong posture weakened. They were turning the queen into a shell. The cruel interrogations. The humiliations extended beyond her cell. Revolutionary officials brought her into interrogation rooms, where the air was thick with smoke and hostility. These were not sessions seeking truth, they were rituals designed to break her emotional resistance. The questions were filled with accusations crafted to shock and degrade. They blamed her for everything, from the famine to the war, to imagined conspiracies. Hay accused her of betraying France, of manipulating her husband, of seducing ministers, and of plotting murders. Even when she remained silent, her silence was written down as guilt. But the worst was yet to come. The weaponization of motherhood. Revolutionaries understood that no humiliation could hurt Marie Antoinette more deeply than attacking her identity as a mother. After the failed escape attempt at Varennes, she clung even more tightly to her children, protecting them fiercely within the prison walls. At first, they allowed the family to stay in the same part of the tower, but gradually, in a calculated manner, they tore them apart. Louis XVI was taken away. Her daughter was removed from her care, and most devastating of all, her young son Louis Charles, the Dauphin, the future king in monarchist eyes, was taken into revolutionary custody. They isolated him, bribed him, starved him, and beat him until he was emotionally broken. Revolutionaries then manipulated the terrified child into making false accusations against his mother, accusations so vile and unnatural that even hardened revolutionaries hesitated when reading them aloud. And Marie Antoinette? She was forced to listen. She heard his cries through the walls. She knew what they were doing. She begged to see him. She pleaded with guards. She attempted to calm him through thin stone walls. But nothing changed. This was not justice. It was psychological torture at its most cruel. Witnesses later wrote that this was the first time they saw Marie Antoinette's spirit truly fracture. She, who had held back tears when accused of treason, now broke down silently when she realized her son was being broken not to destroy him, but to humiliate her. The deprivation of basic needs. Meals in the temple were intentionally poor. Sometimes the food was edible but cold. Other times it was stale, undercooked, or served in cracked pottery. She had no fine silverware, no prepared dishes, no servants. On certain days, meals were intentionally delayed without explanation. Water was rationed. Firewood was limited, leaving her freezing in winter nights. Each deprivation was a reminder that she no longer mattered. Her bed was thin and lumpy. Bedbugs and fleas crawled through the blankets. Her gowns, simple, coarse cotton dresses, gave her no warmth. The guards mocked the queen, who once spent thousands of livres per year on clothing for now wearing rags. Marie Antoinette, once known for her porcelain skin, now suffered chapped lips, cracked hands, and unending cold. The loss of physical space. Her world shrank dramatically. The grand halls of Versailles were replaced with a room barely larger than a closet. She paced back and forth to keep warm, often taking only 5 or 6 steps before turning around. To a woman used to gardens, forests, theatres and salons, this confinement felt like suffocating inside a coffin. During her imprisonment, she occasionally asked to go outside for air, but guards refused. They feared her presence in the courtyard might inspire sympathy from passers-by. Revolutionaries wanted her to disappear from public consciousness, reduced to a ghost before her execution. The humiliation in minor details, even small actions, became tools of torment. When she combed her hair, guards laughed. When she washed, they watched. When she tried to write, they snatched the paper away. When she attempted to pray, they interrupted. Her letters were seized, censored, or destroyed. Every attempt to maintain dignity was challenged by a barrage of petty cruelty. Her chamber pot was not emptied regularly. The stench in her cell became another layer of humiliation. This was deliberate. They wanted Marie Antoinette to feel not like a queen, but like an animal in a cage. The transformat. Ion, they wanted. Revolutionaries believed that by stripping her of identity, privacy, family, and dignity, they could transform the queen into a broken, defeated woman. They wanted her to face trial as a figure already destroyed, emotionally collapsed, physically weakened, and psychologically shattered, and in many ways it worked. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Her once full cheeks hollowed. Her hair turned nearly white. Her posture hunched under the weight of grief and illness. The queen who once commanded Versailles now trembled when guards entered her cell. She was so weakened that even the simplest actions, standing, eating, sleeping, required great effort. But Marie Antoinette, even in her darkest moments, never entirely lost the dignity that revolutionaries tried so hard to crush. When guards mocked her, she often remained silent. When they degraded her, she did not lash out. And even while grieving and isolated, she carried herself with a quiet, exhausted pride that shocked those expecting her to break completely. Yet the humiliation rituals inside the temple were only the beginning. The revolution still had one final stage planned, one more arena where they would showcase their hatred before the entire nation, the courtroom. From the temple prison, she would walk not toward freedom or mercy, but toward the most vicious public trial of the French Revolution. Of all the tortures Marie Antoinette endured in the temple prison, none pierced her soul as deeply as what the revolutionaries did to her son, Louis Charles, the 8-year-old Dauphin of France. The daughter of emperors, the queen of the world's most powerful monarchy, had been stripped of her crown. Her husband had been led to the scaffold. Her body had been weakened by cold, hunger, and fear. But it was the systematic destruction of her child, carried out step by step, intentionally and ruthlessly, that inly broke the last pieces of her heart. The pain of losing a throne was nothing. The pain of losing her son was everything. A boy who should have been king. Louis Charles was born in 1785, a child of extraordinary expectation. As the second son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, he had not been destined to inherit the throne at first. But after the death of his older brother at age 7, Louis Charles became the Dauphin, the future king, the hope of the Bourbon dynasty. He was gentle, shy, affectionate, and intensely attached to his mother. The queen adored him. She held his hand everywhere, read to him, and tried to shield him from the cruelties of court life. In Versailles, he was a symbol of France's future. In the eyes of monarchists, he represented continuity and stability. But to the revolutionaries, he represented something entirely different. They saw him as the living symbol of monarchy, the bloodline they wanted to sever forever. Killing him directly would turn him into a martyr, but breaking him slowly, turning him against his own mother, making him recite lies that would haunt her, that cruelty served their political goals far better, and so began one of the darkest episodes of the French Revolution, the first separation. When the royal family was imprisoned in the Temple Tower, the children were allowed to remain with their parents. For Marie Antoinette, those first weeks in captivity were bearable only because she could comfort her son and daughter. She held them through storms of fear, told them fairy tales when the guards shouted outside, and tried to reassure them that the world was not ending. But as the revolution grew more radical, the authorities realized that the Queen was too strong emotionally as long as her son remained with her. On July 3, 1793, guards entered the Queen's cramped cell and announced that Louis Charles was being taken. Away, Marie Antoinette begged, pleaded, and fought. Eyewitnesses said she threw herself in front of the guards. She clung to her son so tightly that it took several men to pull him from her arms. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, collapsed in sobs. The entire prison echoed with the child's terrified cries. From that moment, the boy who was supposed to be king disappeared into a nightmare. The abuse that followed. Revolutionary leaders believed they could re-educate the child, turn him into a model Republican citizen. But in practice, their methods were far from humane. Louis Charles was placed under the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, a man chosen not for compassion but for loyalty to the revolution. Simon was instructed to reform the boy, which meant breaking him psychologically. What followed is among the cruelest stories in French history. The child was beaten when he refused to sing revolutionary songs. He was threatened with starvation if he asked about his mother. He was forced to drink alcohol until he became ill and disoriented. He was locked in dark rooms filled with rats. He was left alone for days at a time, crying for help that never came. The small prince who once slept in silk now slept on straw. He lost weight rapidly, his hair tangled, his skin turned pale and sickly. Witnesses later described him as feral, unable to speak clearly, traumatized beyond recognition. But the worst cruelty was still to come. The forced testimony against his mother. Revolutionaries wanted Marie Antoinette to face a public trial, but they knew treason accusations alone might not fully turn the people against her. They needed something more shocking, something that would stain her reputation forever. They decided to use her son as a weapon. Under intense psychological torture, Louis Charles was manipulated into making false statements about his mother. He was coached, threatened, and terrorized until he repeated the lies they wanted, that his mother had corrupted him, that she had committed unspeakable acts, that the royal family had used him for immoral purposes. These were monstrous lies, invented purely to destroy her. But the boy was so broken, so terrified, so confused, that he repeated them. And then, in the cold brutality of the temple's stone hallways, they made sure Marie Antoinette heard what he had said. The moment that shattered her. During her trial, the prosecutors read the false testimony aloud in the courtroom. They described Louis Charles's statements in explicit detail, accusing her of crimes that no mother could bear to hear. Marie Antoinette, already pale and frail, trembled violently. Those present said her face went white as marble, but she did not scream, she did not faint. Instead, she stood and spoke words that silenced even her enemies. Nature refuses to answer such a charge brought against a mother. I appeal to all mothers here. The courtroom of hardened revolutionaries fell silent. Many in the audience, especially women, began to cry. Even the prosecutors shifted uncomfortably, but the damage had been done. Marie Antoinette realized in that moment that her child had been broken, that he had been forced to betray her, and worst of all, that she could not save him. This realization wounded her more deeply than any chains, any insults, any cold nights in prison. The sounds through the walls. Long before the trial, while still imprisoned, she had already endured weeks of another torment, the ability to hear her son suffering. The Temple Tower walls were thick, but not thick enough. At night, the Queen sometimes heard muffled crying coming from the floor below, her son's cries. She heard guards yelling, she heard banging, she heard the cruel laughter of those punishing him. She would, it alone in her cell, pressing her hands against the stone, whispering to him even though she knew he could not hear. This slow torture, the constant sound of her child's pain, drove deeper into her soul than the cold, the hunger, or the fear of the guillotine. The revolutionaries knew it too. They intentionally placed him in a cell close enough that she could hear his misery but never reach him. It was a psychological weapon designed with precision. The slow death of Louis Charles. After Marie Antoinette's execution, the boy remained in the temple. With no mother to fight for him, he was left to waste away. The abuse continued, though now it was mixed with neglect. He grew sicker, quieter, weaker. By 1795, at just 10 years old, Louis Charles died alone in his cell. His body was discovered covered in sores, malnourished, and severely infected. The future king of France had been reduced to a neglected orphan in a filthy prison. He died not knowing his mother had fought for him until her last breath. The emotional death of a queen. Marie Antoinette's physical execution took place in October 1793, but emotionally, spiritually, she died the moment they broke her son. Her grief was visible in everything she did. She rarely ate, she barely slept. She stopped speaking unless spoken to. Her hair turned fully white. She walked slowly, sometimes trembling. She clutched her rosary constantly. The proud Queen of Versailles had become a grieving, hollow mother awaiting death. The revolutionaries who thought they could humiliate her with poverty, filth, and insults never truly succeeded. But when they destroyed her child, they destroyed her heartbeat. The time Marie Antoinette was dragged from the temple prison to face trial in October 1793, the revolution had already decided her fate. The courtroom was not a place of justice, it was a stage, and the actors had rehearsed their Inez long before the Queen ever entered the chamber. The woman who walked into the revolutionary tribunal was not the radiant Queen of Versailles the world remembered. Marie Antoinette was gaunt, exhausted, pale from illness, and weakened from months of deprivation. Her hair was fully white. Her clothing was plain and rough. She had been deliberately starved, isolated, humiliated, and broken. But the revolutionaries wanted more. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted an execution that looked like justice, even if justice was the last thing they intended to deliver. A courtroom built for drama, not truth. The tribunal was held inside a former royal palace, the Palais de Justice, an ironic twist the revolutionaries delighted in. The building echoed with whispers, shuffles of paper, and the murmurs of a hostile audience eager to see the Austrian she-wolf finally torn apart. Above all, the room was intended to be intimidating. The judges sat high above the accused, looking down at her as if she were an insect. Revolutionary guards stood on every corner. Crowds pressed close to the barriers, hungry for blood. The air was thick with tension, anger, and the unmistakable scent of vengeance. Marie Antoinette was brought in wearing a simple white bonnet and black dress. Her hands trembled. But those who watched her enter the court noted something remarkable. Despite her frailty, she walked with a strange, quiet dignity, as if determined not to let them see fear. It made the revolutionaries hate her even more. The charges, a catalogue of political theatre. The prosecutors presented a list of accusations, so exaggerated, so absurd, that even some revolutionaries whispered they might be going too far. They claimed Marie Antoinette had conspired to bankrupt France, plotted with Austria to destroy the revolution, sent secret letters to foreign armies, manipulated her husband like a puppet, hoarded grain to starve the people, tried to poison revolutionaries. Most accusations had no evidence whatsoever. They were lifted from pamphlets, rumors, and politically motivated fantasies. But truth was irrelevant. The trial was a performance. Facts would only get in the way of the script. One prosecutor even blamed her for the famine of 1788, despite the fact that weather, crop disease, and poor harvests were the actual cause. Another accused her of being responsible for every military defeat France had suffered. Another claimed she personally encouraged bloodshed on the streets. The revolution did not need evidence. They needed enemies. And Marie Antoinette was the easiest enemy of all. The attack posters and public fury. Outside the tribunal, crowds swarmed like spectators at a festival. Newspapers distributed caricatures portraying her as a vampire draining France's blood, a serpent poisoning the nation, or a monster devouring her own children. Every tavern in Paris echoed with slogans calling for her death. The revolutionaries made sure the trial was open to the public. They wanted noise. They wanted rage. They wanted the people to feel as though they were participating in the destruction of the monarchy. When Marie Antoinette attempted to speak, the crowd jeered loudly. Guards slammed their weapons on the floor to silence her. The courtroom was not a place of reason but a circus fueled by hatred, a defense attorney who was afraid to defend her. The Queen's court-appointed lawyer, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, was a courageous but doomed figure. Defending the most hated woman in France was a death sentence. Anyone who stood up for Marie Antoinette was labeled a traitor. During the trial, he spoke so quietly the audience could barely hear him. When he raised objections, the judges cut him off. When he tried to cite evidence, they dismissed it. Yet Chauveau-Lagarde later confessed that Marie Antoinette astonished him with her composure. She answered questions calmly, even when prosecutors tried to trap her. She showed intelligence, memory, and clarity, qualities the revolutionaries desperately wanted to deny her. Her every word made the judges more determined to silence her. The most vicious moment of the trial. Then came the accusation that changed everything, the one designed not only to convict her, but to stain her legacy forever. They brought up the forced testimony of her son, Louis Charles, tortured, brainwashed, and psychologically destroyed, had been coerced into repeating fabricated accusations. The courtroom fell into a sick, eager silence. The prosecutor read the statement slowly, confidently, knowing the effect it would have. The lie was monstrous, the shame intended was unbearable, and every eye in the courtroom turned to Marie Antoinette, waiting for her reaction. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not argue. Instead, after a long, trembling moment, she stood and addressed the audience directly. Nature itself refuses to answer a charge so monstrous. I appeal to all mothers here. It was the only moment in the entire trial where the courtroom was silent, not from intimidation, but from shame. Women in the gallery cried. Even some hardened revolutionaries lowered their eyes. But the judges did not care. They moved on quickly. Compassion had no place in their script. False witnesses and invented testimonies. The next phase of the trial was even more farcical. The tribunal brought in witnesses who were bribed or threatened to speak against her. Some were former palace servants seeking favor. Others were political ideologues who had never even met her. They claimed she held secret meetings every night. She was imprisoned during most of the dates mentioned. They claimed she funded foreign armies. Her personal finances were heavily monitored. They claimed she smuggled gold. The monarchy was bankrupt. One man even claimed he saw her hosting foreign agents in the Tuileries. On a date when she was documented to be gravely ill and confined to bed, the audience laughed. The prosecutors smiled proudly, and the judges nodded knowingly. This was not justice. It was a purge disguised as a legal process. Marie Antoinette's quiet resistance. Remarkably, throughout the trial, Marie Antoinette held herself with dignity. She remained calm, even when insulted. When she was interrogated aggressively, she responded gently but firmly. When false accusations were hurled at her, she looked at her accusers with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. She did not beg. She did not scream. She did not collapse. It was her strength, not her weakness, that terrified the revolutionaries. Her serenity made their rage look unhinged. Her composure made their cruelty obvious. Every moment she remained dignified. The political theater of the tribunal weakened, and so they sped up the process. They refused delays. They denied her the chance to call witnesses. They ignored her lawyers' arguments. They skipped important procedures. They needed to silence her before she revealed just how shameless their trial really was. The verdict decided before the trial began. After 2 days of ceaseless interrogation, the judges left to deliberate. The audience knew they would return with only one answer. The verdict had been written before Marie Antoinette ever stepped into the courtroom. Guilty, guilty of treason, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of crimes against the nation, guilty of being a queen. The judges returned after less than an hour. The sentence was unanimous: death by guillotine. Marie Antoinette listened as they read the decree. She did not scream, she did not protest. Those present said she simply closed her eyes for a moment, perhaps imagining her children, perhaps praying, perhaps accepting that her life was over. The revolutionaries had finally won their performance. But the woman they condemned to death walked out of the courtroom not as a defeated criminal, but as a mother, a widow, and a queen who had endured the worst cruelty the revolution could invent. Her final night would show a strength even her enemies could not suppress. The final night of Marie Antoinette's life, October 15, 1793, stands as one of the darkest, most psychologically torturous episodes in the era of the French Revolution. It was not enough for the revolutionaries to condemn her to death. It was not enough to parade her as a criminal before the world. They wanted to break her, to erase her identity as queen, mother, and woman entirely before the blade touched her neck. And so, in those last hours, they subjected her to calculated humiliations and forms of emotional punishment designed to leave her fragile, weakened, and utterly stripped of dignity. Inside the dank stone walls of the Conciergerie, often called the antechamber to the guillotine, Marie Antoinette had already endured weeks of oppressive surveillance, loneliness, and despair. But the night before her execution, the cruelty intensified sharply. She had been sentenced only that afternoon. The trial lasted less than 2 days, and the verdict, death by guillotine, had been delivered in the early hours of the morning. As soon as the tribunal announced it, the weight of inevitability fell on her shoulders like a crushing stone. There would be no appeal, no delay, no mercy. Still, in the face of that crushing verdict, Marie Antoinette tried to rest. But the guards controlling her fate had other plans. Her cell was small, barely lit by a single candle. The heavy door remained open, not out of generosity, but to ensure the guards, 2 men posted inside her cell at all times, could stare at her without interruption. Sleep deprivation had long been used as a weapon during her imprisonment, but on this final night, it turned into a deliberate strategy of torment. Every time her head dipped, or her body sagged against the wooden chair where she had been told to sit, the guards would shift loudly, clear their throats, or stomp their boots. Some even whispered to each other, deliberately loud enough that she could hear their crude jokes about the morning ahead. Marie Antoinette, who had once slept on silk sheets surrounded by loyal attendants, was now kept awake by the clatter of metal, the scrape of boots, and the murmurs of men who viewed her as a trophy of the revolution's triumph. The candle flickered. The stone floor radiated cold. Her hands trembled, not from fear alone but from exhaustion. She had barely slept in days. Around 2 a.m., she was given permission to write a final letter. It was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. In calm, steady handwriting, she poured out her heart, her grief at being separated from her children, her acceptance, death, and her insistence that she had tried to remain strong and innocent before God. The letter was full of dignity, sorrow, and motherly tenderness, a final testament of her humanity. The guards, however, never delivered it. They confiscated it instantly and kept it hidden. Even her last written words were denied their intended recipient. Her last hours were not spent in peace, but in the presence of relentless surveillance. There was no privacy even to pray. When she kneeled to pray, a guard stepped closer. When she cried silently, another guard watched her with unblinking eyes. Their instructions were explicit. She could not be left alone for even a second. The revolutionaries feared escape attempts, suicide, or outside rescue, even though all such possibilities were fantasies by that point, and yet, through the exhaustion, Marie Antoinette continued to behave with a certain composed sorrow. She asked for her rosary, though it had earlier been taken from her. She asked to see a priest, but her request was delayed and complicated by politics. When a priest finally arrived early in the morning, he spoke with her briefly through the bars as the guards listened. Even confession was denied true privacy. As dawn approached, preparations for her execution intensified. One of the most humiliating rituals she endured that morning was the cutting of her hair. In the cramped cell, as two guards held her arms steady, an executioner roughly chopped her hair close to the scalp. For centuries, the long hair of royal women had been a symbol of femininity, elegance, and nobility. Cutting it was a symbolic stripping of identity, an act of degradation meant to transform a queen into nothing more than a body for execution. The shears scraped across her scalp, pulling painfully at the roots. Her hair, once styled with jewels, pearls, and ribbons, fell in clumps on the dirty floor. Not allowed even the dignity of grooming, Marie Antoinette sat motionless as her last physical crown, the hair she had carried since childhood, was taken away. After the haircut came the binding of her hands. The rope was tight. Binding the hands of a queen was meant to be a final insult. She did not resist. Eyewitnesses described her as pale, weak, and utterly exhausted, but still holding herself with a quiet, tragic composure. Her body may have been broken, but her posture remained dignified. When the execution cart arrived outside, the crowds already stretched across the streets. Women pushed forward, men jeered, children were lifted onto shoulders to catch a glimpse. The guards led Marie Antoinette from her cell to the cart, but in her weakened state she stumbled. Her shoes slipped on the step. The exhaustion, the hunger, the sleepless night, all of it collided at once. She nearly fell, and the guards grabbed her arms. But even then, she whispered an apology for stepping on the executioner's foot, a moment that would later be immortalized as her last words of courtesy. Her lack of sleep, the emotional torment, and the isolation had achieved what her captors wanted. She appeared frail, drained, and devoid of the radiant presence she once carried. The queen who had once dazzled Versailles with extravagant dresses and sparkling laughter was now a ghostly figure in plain white, her hair shorn, her wrists bound, and her face pale from terror and exhaustion. The cart moved slowly, giving the people ample time to stare. They shouted insults, "Widow Capet," "Austrian whore," words meant not to judge but to hurt. And yet throughout the journey, Marie Antoinette never lost her composure. The final night of her life had not given her rest. It had not allowed her a moment of silence or stillness. It was calculated psychological punishment. A queen would die in the morning, but the woman was meant to break before she ever reached the blade. By the time she arrived at the guillotine platform, she had not slept properly in days, had barely eaten, and had been subjected to relentless humiliation. Her captors could not take her dignity fully, but they tried, and they attacked her spirit with every tool they had: sleeplessness, isolation, surveillance, coldness, and cruelty. Thus ended the final night of Marie Antoinette's life, not with peace or prayer, but with torment. And when the blade finally fell, it silenced not just a queen, but a woman who had already endured more suffering in her last hours than most could imagine.